You know, I mean, I was at a seminar just the week before I was here in Tokyo on climate change and migration. Now, I've been going to the COP meetings almost since '97, and it's only in the last year that these have, you know, that the reality of what would be climate change refugees. And of course, all you have to do is to start thinking of what people are saying about the melting of glaciers. I mean, it came as an enormous shock to me in Thailand, or in Bali 2 years ago, when what's his name? He teaches that he gave a lecture and basically said 4 billion people are dependent on tropical glaciers for their water and for their agriculture. And of course, you can start naming Asia, the Himalayas, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Salween, the Mekong, well, the Irrawaddy over further, and the Yangtze and the Yellow River, all coming off either the Tibet Plateau or the back further on the Himalayas, and that 80% of that could be gone by year 2030. Now, you don't need a great imagination to realize that there'll be a huge amount of migration out of those areas. So those are issues that need to be taken seriously. And also, you know, I mean, last week in Copenhagen, the people who were preparing for the December meeting, a lot of people are saying that the IPCC projections in the fourth assessment report, bad and all as they appear, are actually probably out by factors of 2 or 4. What's his name? Your man here, Jim, the man who was working on the glacier on Greenland. James Hansen.
Yes.
Sorry. I mean, he basically says that it's out by 4, a factor of 4. The IPCC says 59 centimeters by the year 2000. Hansen says, I put a 4 behind that. So does Stephen Ramsdorff of the Potsdam Institute in Germany, who's doing work in Antarctica on the western side of Antarctica. So all of these are going to feed into how, you know, human well-being, and how do we achieve it? I'd love to see myself as a priority different kinds of economic policies. And it was interesting last year. I mean, there were two economic reports last year on agriculture. One by the agricultural technicians. It's IAATD, 3-year program supported by even the bank and FAO, saying that basically, if we want to feed the world, we don't go into GM. We go into supporting the kind of traditional farming that people have been doing, but that we bring to it research and investment, and you know, to the various ways it's done. I mean, the bulk of agricultural investment in the last 40, 50 years has been at male farmers. You know, anyone who's been in Asia, you know, women in agriculture are probably worth twice, you know, the role of. I mean, they do for rice paddies. They do generally the weeding, which is more important than sowing, and some of the harvesting.
Africa too.
Pardon?
Africa too.
Yeah, Africa too. So, and that was one. And then in November this year, another study came out on organic farming, and it was an empirical study on East Africa and West Africa, saying, you know, that this is, and I think we need to support these, get them out known and better known into the public domain, and because like if you don't have food and water, anything else is irrelevant. And none of these are captured by the trade agreements, like, you know.
No way.
And
could I ask you a question about growth?
yes,
Obviously, we have super abundant, obscene growth
yeah.
in the West and in the
Sure.
North. But we have pockets around the world where growth is probably, you know, the only way people can move beyond where they are. And I always find myself a bit on the horns of a dilemma
Sure.
on this question of growth.
That's a very good question, because I mean, don't forget, I kind of came on all of this working among the Tabole, who ate once a day, if at all. And when I went in there was 50% infant mortality, so it's pretty, like, that's it. It's hard to get worst case scenario. And the answer is, of course, yes. But you see, one of the elements of the UNFCCC, and this is at the level of both ideology and technology, is we are absolutely clear that every society in the last 250 years, since James Watt, that has gone down the road to economic well-being and affluence, have gone down the heavy petrochemical route, starting with coal, then with gasoline, with oil and or natural gas. Climate change and peak oil is telling us that neither of these, this particular route is no longer available to anyone, ultimately. I mean, the figures talked about by 2020, if it gets into the Copenhagen Agreement, will be 25 to 40% by 2020. But the third aspect of the UNFCCC is this appropriate clean development mechanisms and technology. So I think that is crucial. That yes, the Tabolis, they need to eat twice and 3 times a day. That will involve uses of energy. It would also involve, I know in one of my PowerPoints I do make the point where the churches and religions need to be very prophetic, and there is a certain amount of carbon left. So who gets to use that? The present methodology is the market. So here's my money, I'm willing to put what you cost, I'm willing to pay. The second method is, if you're not interested in my money, how about my army? Will you give it to me if I send in the troops? The third is equity and need. Now, I think it's an area where the churches could and should do a huge educational and formation of conscience around that very question. That obviously people like the Taboli will need a greater amount of per capita emission of fossil fuel to get to the level of affluence, or to get to the level of well-being. Forget about affluence, that their food, clothing, shelter, health and education are met so that they have the same aspirations as you and I do. If a boy or a baby is born in Washington or in Dublin, that they're going to live, they're not going to be dead, 50% of them are not going to be dead by the year 5, you see. So it's understandable. Now the difficulty with this, of course, it's the most aspirational aspect of the UNFCCC, because of the way we have structured our economics and the infrastructure that goes with it, particularly here with patents. I mean, I was in Nairobi, and the governments were talking about clean development mechanisms. Now, one of the things when you go to the UN, many of you have been to the UNFCCC, there's all kinds of stalls in town, both your friends and your enemies. I always make a point of going to the enemies. Like, I'd always go to the nuclear stand and their talks to see what they're talking about. But I remember going to one of basically a businessmen's association, and the guy got up and he said, "Look, there's all that nonsense being talked about in there in the General Assembly. They're talking about our patents. They haven't asked us, and they're not willing to pay us. So I mean, they're talking nonsense." And that's the reality, actually, at the moment. So how will, for example, the area of energy, of even stoves, an efficient stove to go to the body to help them to use less fossil fuel energy well, if there's a patent on it, that's too bad. And this is the ideology of neoliberalism. I don't know how many of you read Ha Jung-chun's, the Korean economist. I mean, he looks at the whole neoliberal mix, you see, and free trade and all of that, and he said this is what the Washington Consensus has been pushing on third world countries. But wouldn't it be nice to look at, actually, did anyone ever follow that? So let's start with post-Tudor Britain. No, they didn't. What about Netherlands? No, they didn't. Germany, Holland, Switzerland. What about the United States? No, they didn't. So none of them actually did this. But you say this is the only way.